Good morning. Good morning. Happy Thursday. Happy Thursday. It is June 25th, 2020. Can you believe it? We are almost 6 months down for 2020. My name is Carol White. I am your life detox strategist, and I would like to welcome you to this week's episode of When Life Needs a Detox. I'm going to have to apologize for being as late as I am, but I keep forgetting that my cameras for the YouTube will only work on Chrome. So it tends to set me back because I'm so used to using the Microsoft Explorer. I'm learning. I am learning though. We're going to get started today. Today's topic is racism and how history can and has been manipulated. Now, I came up with this topic because, as I said in last week's episode, I got a lot of flack and negative feedback when I said that we as African Americans have to be careful of how our history is recorded. And I also made mention of we have to be careful of who records our history. Like I said, I was called Adolf Hitler. I was told I had no right to change or manipulate history. And who's going to record it? You? Well, actually, yes. I am going to record my history. I'm recording my history right now. But I also did some research. There isn't any aspect of history that has not been manipulated, changed, or made into a flat out lie. There isn't. And I think if we're going to make this a little more palatable or a little more understandable, we need to look at American history and how it has been manipulated, changed, or just flat out lied about in order to purport itself, in order to make itself seem better or far greater than it is. And I'm going to get flack on this, and it's okay, but I'm not doing anything but telling the truth. We're going to go all the way back to the first Americans, the Pilgrims. First of all, they were not pilgrims. The name Pilgrims did not come in until the 1800s when the research was done on the voyage of the first settlers to America. And they called it a pilgrimage. So they renamed the separatists, which is who they were, because they separated themselves from the Church of England because they didn't appreciate or approve of the policies of the Church of England. And they called the separatists Pilgrims. They renamed them. Isn't that interesting? How you can manipulate history? Now, the first thing we're going to talk about is, now that we've cleared up who the Pilgrims, i.e. separatists, are, we need to clear up the truth around their voyage from England to America in 1620. They didn't. The separatists did not travel from England to the Americas in the year 1620. You see, they left England in the year somewhere between 1607 and 1608, depending on whose history information you read. It's 1607 and others it's 1608. So you have to say somewhere between 1607 and 1608. The separatists had to leave England because they were denounced as traitors to the crown. Because understand, in England in the 1600s, church and state were indelibly linked together. So if you spoke out against the church, you spoke out against the crown, and that was treason. Well, you commit treason in England, you have a choice of being beheaded, hanged, or you leave. Well, the separatists, a certain group of separatists, chose to leave. And they traveled from England to Holland. They landed in Amsterdam. I think the port was called Leyden. So that they could experience religious freedom. So understand this. This group of separatists left England in 1607, 1608, and traveled to Holland for religious freedom. Now, some of the history that you will read will speak on this, and they'll say, well, technically, the Pilgrims, i.e. separatists, did travel from England to America. They just did a pit stop for 12, 13 years in Holland. No. Mm-mm. Either you traveled from England to the Americas or you didn't. Now, you have to understand who the separatists were. The separatists were farmers. They were farmers. They had no social standing, no political standing, and no financial standing. They were poor. So the question becomes, how did all of these poor people afford ship fare for themselves and their families to get to Holland? Well, they did it the way most people who wanted to leave England to travel did it. They signed contracts with the ship's captain, who sold the contracts once he got to their port of destination in order to recoup the ship fare and a little something on the side. It's called indentured servitude. We spoke about this a couple of weeks ago. Indentured servitude, i.e. white slavery. So the separatists entered into contracts for indentured servitude, went to Holland, and they experienced religious freedom. But they experienced a couple of other things. They experienced outright poverty. Understand, they were farmers. They moved into the city. It's not like they could afford to buy land and go farm. Besides which, they were owned by someone who put them to work in menial labor positions. They worked 6 days a week, men, women, and children. Sunday was their day of worship when they experienced their religious freedom. Now, that's the first thing they discovered. Being a poor farmer in Amsterdam means you were just poor. Being an indentured servant meant you were just poor. They lived hand to mouth. There was no money to save. They were working off a debt already. The second thing they discovered is that while they were on their farms and they lived by the Bible, you move these Bible believers into a city where there are more faiths to consider, more philosophies to consider, and more entertainment to consider. The separatists found that they were losing control of their children. They could not keep their children under control because now they're seeing different faiths, different philosophies, different art, different sciences, different ways of entertainment. So they were losing control. So here's the thing. Once their contracts were up, they made the decision that in order to bring their kids back into the separatist fold, they were going to have to travel to the Americas. Why? Because there would be no distractions in the Americas. Not like there was in Amsterdam. But here again comes the problem. They're poor. They don't have ship fare. So what did they do? They entered into contracts again with the captain of the Mayflower to get them to the Americas. Now, here's where it gets a little shaky. The contracts stated that they would take the separatists from Amsterdam, Holland, to the port in Virginia, at which time they would meet the person that bought the contracts and work for them. Well, a funny thing happened. As they're coming through Massachusetts, somehow or another, this ship's crew, which had navigated these waters many times before, scuttled their ship on what is now known as Plymouth Rock. So a couple of things had to happen. Number one, the ship had to be repaired. And number two, they needed to come up with a living situation. So what they did was they actually found a deserted Indian camp because there had been whites coming through before, and apparently they had brought disease with them. It killed off the Indians, and the ones that were left abandoned the Indian camp. So now they have a camp that they can build on and come up with living quarters. Well, while they're doing this, the owner of the contracts wants to know where his property is. The property, those who signed the contract said, well, we didn't land in Virginia, so we really are not under contract anymore. At which point, the owner of the ship and the owner of the contract says, you not only owe me for a scuttled ship, you owe us for the contracts. You're going to have to work that off. And I want to just point out something in this. Had the separatists made it to Virginia, they would have been indentured servants. And nobody would have given them a second thought in history. But because of this circumstance, the separatists are given credit for creating Plymouth, Massachusetts, which they did. They did. But the way they got there was a falsehood. There was a manipulation of the facts in order to make it sound better than it was. It was a manipulation of facts. They even went so far as to do a manipulation of how the separatists were dressed. And this was an interesting thing that I found out. There's a difference between the Pilgrims and the Puritans. The Puritans had money, social position, and political position. They weren't the most stylishly dressed people. And they did dress in all black. But in order to dress in all black, you had to have money because black dye was expensive. So the black dye for their clothes, the black dye used in the fabric for their hats, black leather shoes with the big buckles, those were Puritans. That was not the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims were poor. So they tended to dress in colors. Their clothing was in colors: greens, browns, oranges, blues. And that was actually how they could tell who was poor in England. The less color you had in your wardrobe, the more money you made. Isn't that interesting? But like I said, there are so many things that have been manipulated concerning the history of the Pilgrims, because no one really tells us in systematic history, the history we learn in our textbooks, that the Pilgrims were poor. No one tells you that they signed themselves into indentured servitude. No one tells you that in 1620, they traveled from Amsterdam to the Americas under contracts of indentured servitude. We are told that for religious reasons, in 1620, the Pilgrims, which they were renamed, traveled from England to the Americas. And I'm sorry for all of those people who complained and had so much to say about the recording of Black history by Blacks. Who are you kidding? Really? You can look at this history, your history, and say it's okay for you to manipulate your facts, but everybody else has to tell the absolute truth? Now, let's face it, nobody tells the absolute truth. But how can you sit there and say, everybody's got to be more honest than me? If anything I have said is you find offensive, please, I have put all of my references and resources that I used for this week's topic in the feed. You feel free to look them up and you come to your own conclusions. And here's the thing: America wouldn't be America had it not been for the manipulation of history. Why do you think this trend should stop just because now we want to talk about African American history? My name is Carol White. I am your life detox strategist, and this has been this week's episode of When Life Needs a Detox. Whether you agree with me or not, whether you like what I said or not, I love you to the moon and back. We will be here same time next week. Hopefully, I can remember I have to do all of this on Chrome as opposed to Microsoft Explorer. But we will be here next week, Thursday at 8 a.m. Bye-bye now. Have a great week.